Hello again, everyone. It's Sunday, May 3rd, 2020. On the church calendar, this is the fourth Sunday of Easter. On the calendar of our hearts, it is the eighth Sunday since we have been able to be together in person, separated as we are by concerns for the coronavirus. I want you to know that your session has made a decision this week about the timing of our resuming regular church activities, including Sunday worship in person on State Street in Weiser. And that decision is that there is no decision, which is to say, that we are waiting because we know that we do not have enough understanding, enough knowledge to make a fully informed and consciously correct decision. Now, there are lots of voices calling out for everything to be reopened. Let's get life back to normal. And you and I both understand that desire. We feel it ourselves. The thing is, though, that there are no medical or scientific voices that are saying those things. The doctors, the scientists, and the researchers are all expressing caution. Many of them are expressing, in some cases, dire concern for what is likely to happen to us as a society if we reopen too early, as they believe, many of them, that we're doing. The politicians and the people who are concerned about making money, which includes many of our fellow citizens, to be sure. And money is important to all of us. Those are the voices saying, let's get going. This is too much. We've waited too long already. But again, the medical and scientific voices are the ones expressing a much stronger caution. Those are the voices that the session has chosen to listen to in these days. We continue to be in prayer, and when things look like they're ready for us to begin moving toward at least a preliminary date for restarting or reopening, I assure you, you will be the first to know. So that's the news, or the non-news, from here. Now today, our gospel text is from the Gospel according to John, chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. And if you don't have the lectionary text, if you didn't know that ahead of time and haven't already read the text, take a few moments now to pause the video. Go ahead and read those verses, John 10, 1 through 10, and then we'll start again. So you see, there will be a reopening today. It's just not the big one that we're all waiting for. Okay. I'll see you in a few. We are back. That didn't take long, did it? And yet it is a very important verse. And, it is a very important passage. It's 10 verses. And it focuses on one of our favorite names for Jesus, or a theme, an image about Jesus, and that is Jesus as the Good Shepherd, the Lord who lays down his life for his sheep, who knows the sheep by name, and who leads them beside the still waters. And of course, all of this makes for good sermons, except that somehow or other the preacher must deal with the biblical comparison of himself or herself and the congregation with a flock of sheep. At a fairly young age, I was advised that being called a sheep is an unflattering metaphor at best, and sort of a sneaky, underhanded insult at worst. And of course, I believed what my elders told me. When you are raised in the city, like I was, by parents and teachers and pastors, whose closest encounter with sheep is their favorite wool sweater, you're liable to buy into all sorts of faulty notions about sheep. So, for example, I was told that I should not get too comfortable thinking of myself as one of God's sheep, because sheep are actually smelly and stupid critters who are easily led around by any old fool or false prophet that comes along. I readily accepted the notion that these serene biblical images of tranquil flocks feeding in verdant pastures beside still and peaceful burbling streams are all a sort of a feint, a ruse, a head fake, designed to distract us from the fact that God actually has a pretty low opinion of us, given that he keeps lumping us in with these slobbering, untidy, cud-chewing creatures who exist only to be shaved for their wool, boiled up for lamb stew, or, perhaps, in the best of things, served up on a silver platter at Clarence House, the London town home of the mutton-loving Prince of Wales. Yes, it's true, Charles loves him some sheep. But if you ask someone who raises sheep whether these stereotypes of stupidity are true, they'll tell you that that's all an exaggeration and that actually sheep are not dumb at all. In fact, I think that we can put off those hoary old rumors to the slander of jealous cows. You know how on those Chick-fil-A ads the cows are always talking up chickens? What you may not know is that those same deceitful cows are always talking down sheep. Their hoof prints are all over those ugly rumors, and all because sheep don't behave as they are supposed to, at least from a certain point of view, which is to say they don't act like cows. Now, it's true that you never see a sheep drive in a John Ford Western, because that's not how you move sheep. Sheep are herded from the rear. Cows are herded by the rear, from the rear, by hooting cowpokes with cracking whips and barking dogs. Do you remember 20 years ago or so on TV, we were all transfixed for that great miniseries about those canny old Texas Rangers from Lonesome Dove, Woodrow Call and Gus McCrae, how they spent years of their lives running sheep from Texas to Montana? Oh, it was exciting. But you know, that would never work with sheep. Stand behind sheep making loud noises, and all they'll do is run around you, because they prefer to be led. You push cows, but you lead sheep. And they'll not go anywhere that someone else does not go first, namely their shepherd, who goes ahead of them to show them that everything is all right. Sheep bond with their shepherds. They seem to develop a sort of language of their own that strangers are not privy to. A good shepherd learns to distinguish a bleat of pain from one of pleasure. He knows their names, and they know his voice. If you visit the Holy Land today, you can see some of the very same sights and actually hear some of the very same sounds that Jesus saw and heard, and that informed and shaped and gave content and context to his teachings. Kathy and I stood on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in 1993. Gazing east toward the Golan Heights in Syria, we knew that we were glimpsing an identical horizon to the one that greeted Jesus when he walked along that shoreline 2,000 years ago. My heart soared at the thought of it. Perhaps he even stood right here. In a similar fashion, and in a different part of the country, we saw another sight that would have been very familiar to Jesus. Bedouin shepherds leading their flocks out in the morning and bringing them home from the various pastures they've grazed during the day. The various flocks frequently end up at the same watering hole around dusk. The result looks like chaos to the untrained observer like me, as 8 or 9 small flocks turn into a single mass of pushing, dirty, thirsty sheep. But the shepherds are not concerned at all. When it's time to go home, each one makes his or her own distinctive call, usually a short 5 to 10-second chant or song, or else plays a special tune on a village type of bamboo flute. And right away, that shepherd's flock peels away from the crowd to follow their shepherd home. They know whom they belong to, they know their shepherd's voice, and it is the only one that they will follow. What's clear from shepherding in Israel today and from the text of John's Gospel from 20 centuries ago is that recognizing the voice of the shepherd is all important. The theme is repeated 3 or 4 times in our short text. Verse 3, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Verse 4, when he has brought out his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. Verse 5, they will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. The sheep know his voice. And remarkably, the timbre of the voice of the shepherd is more important to the flock than any tune he sings or she sings. You or I or any old stranger could learn the same tune, the same song, and sing it to the flock, and they would pay no attention at all, or else they might disperse in utter chaos. But they would not follow. When Professor Ken Bailey was teaching New Testament in Beirut, he once had a class with some students from small farming communities in Syria and Lebanon. They were studying the Good Shepherd theme that appears in Luke 15, in Matthew 18, and in John 10. He asked the students if in their earlier years any of them had herded sheep, and it turns out that some of them had. Their personal experiences were richly informative to Bailey and to other members of his class. He says, I asked them what was involved when they acquired a new sheep. A Vetus Boinarian replied that the new sheep needed to be trained to listen to the new voice. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Early each morning, the flock starts to get excited because they've had nothing to eat for 14 hours or more. You know, they were doing the intermittent fasting diet. Anyway, in addition to being hungry, they are restless from being cooped up all night. As daylight increases, they gradually become more active and eager. Finally, they hear the shepherd's voice outside the barred sheepfold door. As soon as the door is opened, the shepherd calls the animals again, and they rush out, eagerly anticipating a new day full of lush grass, fresh mountain air, shady trees, and rest beside peaceful waters. But for the unfortunate new sheep, the voice or the call is all wrong. It doesn't recognize the sound or the song. It cannot go to the party. Well, what happened to that poor animal, I asked. Well, my student explained, it has a temporary nervous breakdown. That sheep will run around and around, banging its head against the rough stone walls of the sheepfold, emitting a stream of pitiful, heartbreaking cries. You see, Dr. Bailey, it needs a few days of therapy to retrain its ear to recognize the voice of the new shepherd. Now, just a minute. Feeling confused and scared, running around in circles and banging your head against the wall. Who is that describing? Sheep? Or you and me? Maybe the metaphor fits after all. Notice now that in verse 3, the sheep hear his voice. And in verse 4, they know his voice. The two are parallel, and yet at the same time there is movement from the first phrase to the second. You see, it's not enough that they hear his voice. His call will have no effect unless they also know his voice. There's a second thematic pairing in these same two verses. In verse 3, the shepherd calls his own sheep by name, and in verse 4, the sheep follow him. The shepherd's action comes first, followed by the response of the sheep. The call means essentially nothing without their response of following the shepherd. Applying the metaphor, Jesus is speaking about the intersection of divine initiative and human response. In a sense, the entire Bible may be said to be a story of this duality. God acts and humans respond. God calls, humans obey or not. God creates, humans discover or destroy. God invites, humans draw near or turn their backs. The sovereignty of the God who acts of God's own will and plan, and the freedom and responsibility of humankind are placed side by side with no explanation of how they are related to each other. Does one usurp the other? Can sovereignty and free will even exist at the same time in the same dimension? These are philosophical questions Jesus shows no interest in. Some people think they have figured out the answers. Truthfully, I don't, and I haven't. What I can say is that this story is timeless and universal. That is, God is always at work, calling, creating, inspiring, inviting, singing songs of freedom and joy over us, and waiting, and then waiting some more to see how we will respond. Surrounded by beeping, blinking devices that call our names, inundated with trivial information masquerading as urgent news, with a cacophony of loud, strident voices filling our ears, demanding our attention and our loyalty, we humans are easily distracted and confused. And so we must be still long enough to tune out all of the clatter and chatter and noise. We must center our minds on the voice of the Good Shepherd, and then, only then, go about our day. Now, it may be that you sometimes have trouble hearing the shepherd's voice. I get that. It's the same for me. So if that's your experience, please be patient with yourself. Some days it whispers. Some days you only hear the wind. Some days it sounds like a love song, and some days like a threat. You know, Jonah, go to Nineveh. No way, God. That's the last thing I'm going to do. God says, way, Jonah. Here's a storm to redirect your path. Sometimes it speaks through the words in the Word. It may be gentle, or it may be firm. It may speak to your heart, or it may sort of stir up a feeling in your gut. But one way or another, it can usually be heard or felt sometime between your getting up and your lying down each day, leading you beside the still waters, restoring your soul. So be patient with yourself. And while you're at it, be patient with the rest of us as well. You know, you can't follow the shepherd all by yourself after all. You're stuck with this flock, or with some flock, and, hey, we're stuck with you. And everyone knows that sheep are, well, they're not dumb, they're not stupid, they're just sheep. We panic easily and refuse to be pushed. We make most of our decisions based on our appetites, and we tend to get into head-butting contests for no reason at all. It's not a pretty sight. But stick with the flock. This is where the shepherd can be found, which makes it your best choice not only for survival, but also for joy. Above all, understand that you belong here. You are part of the flock, not because you measure up, but because you are loved. If you don't believe anything else, believe that. Whether you're here because you believe or because you want to believe, you're here because you belong to God. You did not choose me, Jesus says a little later in John's Gospel. I chose you. And because he chose us, we hear his voice and know his voice, and he knows us, and we follow him, and he gives us eternal life, and we shall never perish. And no one, no power in heaven or on earth shall snatch us out of his hand. Believe it or not, here we are. And truly, here we belong. Thanks be to God. Amen. I will see you next week.